Welcome to Talking with Tatchell. Britain is a flawed democracy. The second chamber of Parliament, the House of Lords, is unelected and unaccountable. Members of the House of Lords, no matter how well or badly they perform their obligations, are there for life. They cannot be replaced. With me to discuss the case for the democratic reform of the House of Lords are Peter Facey, the Director of Unlocked Democracy, and Baroness Ros Scott of Needham Market, a Liberal Democrat peer. Welcome to you both.
Hi.
I'd like to start with you, Ros. I mean, can you just give us a sense of a few ideas about why the Lords needs to reform?
Well, I suppose when I started, I'd never really thought too much about the House of Lords. I mean, people don't, do they? I mean, it's not exactly uppermost on people's minds. But I suppose I had a general sense that if you're going to have a bunch of people making the law that everyone else was going to have to stick by, that they ought to be elected. So I suppose that's where I started from. When I got to the Lords, I began to understand more about what it does and the way that it does it. And so I began to think a lot more about the sort of people that you'd want there and how they should get there. But I suppose what really kind of pushed me into a firm position about elections was the cash for peerages issue, because it really became evident to me that we'd all been tainted by it in some way, and that actually if we're to command public respect, you've got to have a way of getting people there which is open and transparent and everyone can understand. And so I kind of moved through this process now to a position where, when we had the vote in Parliament, I voted for an elected House of Lords.
100% elected or partially?
Yeah, I voted for 100% and 80%. Slightly reluctantly on the 80%, but you know, it's also got to be about the art of the possible. And on that occasion, we were voting to try and find a way to get the reform process through, because what had happened before was we'd had a whole series of votes a couple of years previously where, if you remember, no side won. There was a complete deadlock, and I think, you know, that the reformers wanted to make sure that that didn't happen again. So although I have my doubts about the workability of an 80% elected House, and I prefer 100%, I still voted for it.
Okay. And Peter, what's your view about the compelling case and argument for reform of the Lords?
I think Ros said it, but in a modern democracy, to have the idea that people would make laws on yours, my behalf, because they're appointed by somebody else, and I have no say over. I mean, I happen to agree with the House of Lords more often than I agree with the House of Commons, but ultimately they're not legitimate. And if they're going to make decisions on my civil liberties, on how I'm governed, then I should, at an election time, have an opportunity to say who should be in there and who shouldn't be in there. I accept that I'm only one citizen out of 40 million voters in the United Kingdom, but I should have an opportunity at that point. I don't think it's for the government to decide who should make the laws for me.
What do you say to those who say, well, look, it's good to have a second chamber that is above the fray of party politics, where people with expertise and knowledge can give their input? After all, ultimately, the House of Commons itself has a veto.
I think there's an interesting statistic. People normally say, you know, House of Lords is this place of experts, and with all respect to Ros, I'm sure it is, but it's not subject to the party whip. Well, actually, if you look at the number of rebellions in the House of Commons and the House of Lords, actually, members of the House of Commons rebel probably more than members of the House of Lords. You know, it just happens to be a fact that the reason the House of Lords works is that no party has a majority. It isn't that they're all free thinkers who rebel regularly against their party whips. I mean, of course, crossbenchers and independents don't have party whips, but the bulk of the people in the House of Lords are working peers, and they take a party whip, and they don't rebel any more than members of the House of Commons.
Can you just, one of you, just remind us what's the roughly the party spread in terms of representation in the House of Lords?
Labour's just taken over as the largest party, and it's taken them sort of a decade of appointments to get to that situation. And then kind of coming up behind them...
What numbers are we talking about?
I think it's about 203, something
Labour,
like
yeah.
that. So, yeah. And then kind of coming up behind them are the crossbenchers. They're independent peers. And now some of them clearly aren't entirely independent. I mean, some of them have been political in their careers, but for whatever reason, they now sit on the crossbenches.
How many of those are there?
They're 198, something like that. Then just behind them you now have the Conservatives, and then Lib Dems about 78. Then we've still got bishops. We've got 26 Church of England bishops. We've still got law lords until, I'm not sure. Soon. Coming soon to you, a Supreme Court. It's at some point next year. And then we have some who are called non-aligned, and they're basically the sort of dissidents who've fallen out with their parties and aren't aligned to anyone. And there's a solitary green. So it's changed a lot, actually, because one of the things I noticed when I went there, we always had debates on things like Section 28, civil partnerships and so on. Whenever we went to vote, the reform lobby always lost heavily. And I knew when we won a vote on Section 28 that something had changed. And since then, we've voted through civil partnerships, all sorts of, what I think we'd call progressive legislation. So, yeah, it's changed. The demographic has changed slightly. It's still old. It's still quite white. It's still pretty upper class, but it's not quite as exclusively so as it was. And that does mean that the way that we vote has changed. And Peter's right to an extent. I mean, there is quite a lot of strong party loyalty there, but it's not quite so blind, because at the end of the day, when you're there for life, there's no sanction. If you vote against the whip, the worst thing they can do is to withdraw the whip, and that hurts them more than it does you. So,
yeah. Peter, can you give us a flavour of where the different parties stand now on Lord's reform? Just go through the list.
Yeah. I mean, the easy ones, the Liberal Democrats are basically in favour of 100% elected. We'll settle for 80%. The Conservative Party is in favour of 80% elected. Though that's their policy, it doesn't necessarily mean that that's what their MPs voted for, their peers vote for, but that's the party policy. The Labour Party, their position now is 80 or 100% and elected. And then you've got parties like the SNP and Plaid, which are in theory unicameralist and want to abolish the House of Lords. In practice, they're in favour of it being elected if it's going to be there. And parties like the Greens will come in that category as well. So everybody on paper agrees that what we have at the moment doesn't work, and what we need is to move towards a more democratic second chamber. That's the parties. The problem is, in terms of Lords reform, isn't this where the parties are? It's where their MPs and where their peers are. And the reality is the House of Lords voted against it being a democratically elected chamber, even though the House of Commons actually did vote a week before in favour of 100% elected or 80%. Yeah,
that's an important thing. The last vote, the Commons voted, the majority was in favour of 100% elected second chamber.
And I think what a lot of the opponents don't recognise is how that has actually changed the debate. The government before was basically saying, actually, we want a 50-50 chamber. Now it's basically saying, OK, the game's changed. The House of Commons have now said that actually what we want to do is move towards an elected chamber. And the argument now is that it's between 80% and 100%. And that's the debate. It's now how do we deliver that? There is no longer a debate about whether it's going to be, 20% elected, 80%. All those things have gone. We're now into a new situation. And we have a slight possibility that 100 years after the 1911 Parliament Act, which first said that the House of Lords should be on a popular basis, on a democratic basis, we may get legislation in the 100th anniversary to actually move it, which in British terms is probably quite quick reform. 100 years to do one thing, it's not too bad.
But I can see a great campaign here. The idea of making it the goal to get democratic reform of the Lords by 2011.
But it's fascinating that, yesterday I was dealing with some legislation on more changes to local government and to health structures. And, it's been like a sort of Maoist revolution the last 10 years. Everything has to be reorganised every 3 or 4 years. And yet, no progress on Lord's reform. And the problem is how you move from this general proposition that you need reform to something that everyone sees as workable. And the dilemma that the MPs will always face is that they want a legitimate House of Lords, but they don't want a House of Lords which will be sufficiently legitimate to challenge what they see as their supremacy. And that's always going to be the difficulty for them. Because I'll tell you something, I'm happy to bow to the Commons now because they've been elected. But if I've been out and people have voted for me, I'm damned if I'm going to say, well, actually, I'm just going to roll over and do what the Commons tell me. So, there is that side to how we create something that's workable. I mean, it might be done by 2011, but I'm not convinced, because I think it will begin to fall
I think
on that altar.
I think the problem is the primacy argument about the House of Commons really comes down to powers. At the moment, because we've got this kind of strange situation where the Lords accept they're not legitimate, they don't use the powers they actually have. What I think will happen after reform is we'll go back to a situation where it is actually the powers of the Lords and the Commons which will be used. Now, the simple fact is nobody is talking about replacing the Parliament Acts. And the Parliament Acts basically say that the House of Lords ultimately can say no for a year. And it says that they can't touch financial measures. So, that restriction, we are not going to talk about a situation where the Lords, even if they use their existing powers better and they're more assertive and they are more interventionist, they are not going to become a challenge to the primacy of the House of Commons, because the powers aren't there to allow them to do it. What will happen is on votes where the government says, look, this was in our manifesto, you've got to agree with us, members of the House of Lords in that circumstance will say, well, actually, I was elected too, and actually I'm going to vote my conscience, not your manifesto.
Yeah.
So I think there will be a change, but it's not to the point where we throw everything out and we come into some US Senate situation where the Senate is equal to the lower house in the US.
So
we're not going to be
neither
there.
of you favour any fundamental change to the relationship and powers between the two houses?
In some ways, I would love to, but I'm a campaigner, and the reality is there is no appetite across the political spectrum in anybody taking the decisions in terms of chance of making the laws who wants to overturn the Parliament Acts and actually go back to a situation where the House of Lords and the House of Commons are equals.
I mean, I think
that's not going to happen.
A more interesting question. I mean, we're having this debate in a kind of classic Westminster macho. It's about power, and actually, you needn't have the debate in that way. It can be about function. And so, for example, it's well known that the House of Commons doesn't do a very good job of scrutinising European legislation. Now, that's something that the Lords could do. There's rafts of secondary legislation now, and a lot of it's in that sort of detail of secondary legislation where a lot of controversy arises. It did with casinos, it did with home information packs. Now, secondary legislation and dealing with that could be something that the Lords could do better. So we could actually, in theory, have a grown-up debate about, not about power, but about spheres of responsibility where each does what they do best. But I suspect we won't. We'll get hung up on power.
I think you've got a very good point. I mean, I've long agreed with your position that European legislation is not put under sufficient scrutiny and analysis by the Commons, and this could be a very easy area, a very positive area where the House of Lords could give a very important contribution.
Yeah.
And the other area is you could give the Lords, or the Second Chamber, whatever we call it, the power to sort of protect parts of our Constitution. I mean, at the moment, on things like civil liberties, on the Human Rights Act, a simple majority in the House of Commons ultimately can actually overturn the Human Rights Act. Well, you could actually remove the Parliament Acts from those sort of things and say that, the Second Chamber has a job of protecting fundamental rights in Britain. So that, you have to get the agreement of both the Lords and the Commons to overturn those sort of documents. That would be a positive change, which would strengthen civil liberties in this country and democratic freedoms, but wouldn't kind of threaten the ability of governments to govern.
And I think one of the best things would be about getting rid of the Lords tag. I mean, in some ways, it's a bit of a blast being a Baroness. I mean, I have to be honest. You can get tables in restaurants and that sort of thing. But it is actually quite... It's not descriptive of, people have a view about what they expect a Lord or a Baroness to look like and sound like and to behave, and so they don't feel that that someone who's a Baroness would have any part of their kind of day-to-day life.
Yeah, I saw Baroness Young the other day, and she looked like a hip-hop star.
Well, that's my point. It is change, but people don't kind of view it that way, and I think we're kind of tainted by that as well, and people don't take us seriously as people who would be making decisions on their behalf, because they all think we live in castles and own half of Somerset.
So what do you think we should call it, a Senate, or just an upper house, or...?
Not even sure about that. I mean, I suppose I'd go for Senate, but I'm not hugely hung up about it.
I think certainly within the Labour Party, the debate there tends to be on wanting the most dull name possible. so like a reformed second chamber or something else. I wouldn't be, in the end of the day, upset if we just called it the House of Lords and members became members of the House of Lords. It wouldn't really upset me. I would like a Senate because just, I've watched too much West Wing and, I think it would be a nice idea. I don't think the House of Commons will probably buy it on the grounds that it will, the idea that you could become the senior senator from Birmingham may upset the MPs from Birmingham in terms of, it would sound too good. So that they will probably want something, boring and administrative. Okay.
Can you just bring us up to speed about the government's delays? Just remind us all of what the government promised and what it's actually delivered.
Well, it's been in the Labour manifesto for sort of forever now, and they certainly delivered on the first bit, sort of. They said they'd get rid of the hereditaries, but then of course they actually had to get it through the Lords, and so this really peculiar deal was stitched up where 92 of them stayed on. And we now have this bizarre situation where when one of the 92 dies, we have a by-election for the hereditary peers, which is great because none of them have ever voted before. I mean, they've never been allowed to. And it has to be within the party. So, one of my colleagues, Conrad Russell, sadly died, and we had a by-election to replace him, and the only voters were the remaining Liberal Democrat hereditary peers, and I think there were 3 of them. And because we wanted to be transparent, we got the Electoral Reform Society in, and they ran the ballot for us, and we had 100% turnout, so that was good. And the Earl of Glasgow was duly elected. But, I mean, how sensible is that?
We've managed to go from a medieval chamber to modernise it up to the Holy Roman Empire, where we have hereditary electors now in the House of Lords. And the sad thing is that our hereditary electors are now the only people who actually can say that they faced an election, whereas the bulk of the rest of the members of the House of Lords don't go anywhere near any electorate. The problem is this electorate is rather peculiar and rather select, but it is an electorate.
I wonder if we could just move on to the whole issue of models of reform. How would we elect a new reformed upper chamber? What kind of model? Do you want to both of you throw out some ideas?
Well, I mean, I'm sort of not entirely fixed on this yet. But it seems to me that you need a number of things. I mean, one is that it's got to be elected in a very different way from the House of Commons so that it doesn't cut across what it's doing. So you'd need constituencies on an entirely different basis. And my sort of feel would be that English regions and Scotland and Wales would probably be about right. I know there's a difficulty because people don't identify with their region outside. I mean, certainly English regions outside London.
What about Euro constituencies?
Well, those are
that's what they are.
Yeah,
I mean, I just didn't mention Europe in case somebody blew a gasket.
Yeah.
But so I think probably, and I think the 1 year, the 1 term model has some benefits. You do one long term of 10, 12, 15 years, and that way you're not quite so beholden to the party. I mean, although you've stood for election as a whatever it is you are, I mean, if you do 1 term, you're not beholden to them to get back. So I suppose, that has some attractions. I think there's a practical problem with that model, which is if you're if you're between 35 and 45, you're not going to take 12 years out to sit as a member of the House of Lords or whatever. You're not going to give up your career and then go back. So I think that would tend to mean you'd either get people who are really quite young who might think it was an interesting and exciting thing to do, and it would be, or more likely you'd get a whole load of people who'd maybe got to the age of 50 and could see it as a way, and you might not get the sort of demographic mix that you'd hope for.
I mean, what's your view about the idea of basing it on regional elections? Is that broadly the model that Unlocked Democracy supports?
Yeah. I mean, the problem at the moment is if you actually look at the regional breakdown of members of the House of Lords, it's incredibly skewed to London and the South East. If you come from the North East, where I originally came from, the South West, there are very few people in there who actually come or live in that region because the kind of people who are selected tend to be around the metropolis, around London and that area.
Yeah, but practically it's also because we're not salaried.
Yeah.
We only get paid when we turn up. So if you live in London and you have a business in London, you can do the Lords and you can do your business. If you have a business in the Northwest, you can't.
You can't. No. So, I mean, actually, a regional basis would make sense. It also allows you to elect it by thirds, which is what people want to do. So you don't have it all up at once. You have kind of tranches up so that basically the Lords never have a fresher mandate than the Commons. The Commons, would always have a greater mandate because it would have been elected at one point, whereas the Lords would be staggered over time.
So you'd have a third elected every
5 years.
Every 5 years.
And the idea at the moment is probably on the same day as European elections, maybe encourage more people to vote in the European elections. So you have kind of a fixed point, and let's hope we eventually get fixed term elections for the House of Commons as well. You have a fixed point when effectively the House of Commons and House of Lords and the European Parliament is elected, and you kind of take them in tranches, 5 years, and you basically have, therefore, a 15-year term. There are some problems with having one term, which is basically that you don't ever face the electorate again. So the electorate sends you there, you never get any kind of accountability.
Yeah.
I think the other issue is the nature of the electoral system, whether that is a proportional one or not. Now, for me, if the object is to have something which reflective of the United Kingdom and which kind of ensures that no one party has a majority, because that kind of acts as check and a balance on the House of Commons, then it has to be a proportional system. Even kind of people like Ken Clarke and other kind of leading conservative reformers have accepted that in practice, even though their policy is first past the post in counties, that it should be kind of a proportional system. I think the area where it will become difficulty if they try and hoist a system like the European Parliament system, which is a closed list system. And I think that will cause a lot of tension, with a lot of reformers saying, well, we don't want a system which is basically where you just vote for parties that have no say over individuals.
So what you're suggesting are regional lists, which the parties specify each of their candidates. They have how many members would you say on each regional list? 20 or 30 or something?
Well, I mean, if you basically take that, you're talking about a 400-member Lords probably, and you're electing it, by thirds. So you're electing just over sort of 100 odd. So you're electing kind of maybe
12 per region. Every 5 years, something like that.
Yeah. And so this would be a list, and the names of each of the candidates for each of the parties would be there, and you could pick and choose. So you could vote for one Green and 3 Labour, or 2 Liberal Democrats.
That depends on the system you choose. Yeah. If we go for an open list system where it's party-based, then you'll probably be able to vote for an individual within a party. So, if you stand for the Greens, you can put you for the Greens, or if, Baroness for the Liberal Democrats, you can mark her and say, I want my vote to go to her. If you go for a system which people can actually cross-party vote, so like they use in Ireland, which is now used in Scotland for local government elections, which technical terms are transferable vote, single transferable vote, then you could vote across party. You could say, I want to vote for all the women and do it cross party. I want to vote by the fact that they support fox hunting, or they're good
or
on civil liberties.
Or in a region they all come from Hertfordshire, or
whatever.
Come from the east of England. I mean, whatever.
They have that option. And from our point of view as reformers, what we want to see is something which, yes, gives a balance of parties, because we recognise that's important, but also allows people to say who they actually want from the parties, and not just leaving that to party managers. Because I think at this time when there's a disconnection between the political class and the rest of people, something which was seen to be kind of closed would actually produce more cynicism rather than actually kind of refreshing a democracy, which people like us want to see.
And under the system, would independents be able to stand?
Certainly from my point of view, yes. I mean, we have to recognise the fact that for an independent to get elected in this type of election, they're going to have a high profile. And the likelihood is it's not going to be the likes of me. It may be the likes of you, but it's going to be somebody who has a profile beforehand, because you're going to have a profile across a whole region. So across London, or across, we both live in the eastern region, so across the whole of East Anglia. So they're likely to be people who have got a profile, but there should be no block on independent standing.
And that's where the argument comes in for an 80% elected chamber, so that you do allow some membership for people who are not affiliated to political parties. I mean, I'm still slightly agnostic on that, because I'm still not sure how you'd appoint them and on what basis and where would they come from. And I know in Ireland they have a system where they almost take you from interest groups. I remember meeting an Irish senator who was there because he had been chairman of the Licensed Victuallers Association. That was obviously considered a hugely important qualification. He was actually terrific, but so they tend to do it that way. And I suppose we could look at whether you'd want people from the education sector or the medical profession. Or
I think
whatever.
if you're going to go down that route, and in principle I'm against it, but if we go down it, then what we should say is that parties should not be able to appoint people. Because what you don't want is a sort of second route where if parties are putting people up in elections, they shouldn't also have a say in the bit which is actually kind of for non-party people.
Well, what about the idea, one issue which is very concerning to me is the still very severe gender imbalance in legislatures. What about the idea of having a system where you say there are 12 places up for grabs that you have to vote for at least 6 women?
Well,
that would ensure gender parity and overcome the gender gap.
You could try and make the electorate do that. I mean, at the moment, it tends to be political parties who do that. I mean, most of us have had some sort of attempt at creating a system. And of course, on lists, you can do that. It's much more straightforward. I mean, I know my party, the Liberal Democrats, in 1999, we took advantage of the switch to a list system for the European elections to make sure that half of our MEPs were men and half were women. So I think there is more of an opportunity to do that.
I think that the problem is, if you want to kind of control it in that way, I mean, that's the argument which Jack Straw in the past has used to defend sort of closed lists, was that you can actually have more women and more ethnic minorities because you don't basically trust the electorate to vote for it. The interesting thing is the experience in Scandinavia is they actually had an open, in Norway, had an open list system. And they now have a kind of convention where all the parties put people in man, woman, all the way down. That didn't come because of law. It came because in the 70s there was something called the Revenge of the Women. And basically, feminists in Norway basically said any party which has put a woman down, all women voters should cross every man off before that first woman. And this horrified and scared so many political parties in Norway. But now, no political party in Norway will actually kind of go to the electorate without actually having a balanced ticket. Now, I think by simply moving to having a proportional system, we will get more women. It's not, guaranteed, but we are likely to get it. And it's also about ensuring that we actually educate the rest of our public. The interesting fact is that voters, don't seem to have a problem electing women. The problems tend to be parties selecting women as candidates. And that's where the problem is, not the electorate. It's the parties which have the problem, not the electorate.
Final, in the last 30 seconds or so, what do you think about the idea of a minimum threshold? I mean, my own view is that minor representation is important, that people shouldn't be precluded just because... Why shouldn't there be a pensioners' party if people want it? Why shouldn't it have representation in the House of Lords? That would be a good thing to give the so-called grey vote political kudos. Yeah.
No, I'm in favour of that, and a list system, single transferable vote, does sort of enable you to do that, although, as Peter said, it is actually quite tough as a minority party to campaign across a region that's maybe got 6 or 8 million voters. But I think a second chamber would be enriched by that.
The reality is that you're going to have to get about 10% of the vote to get elected, so I don't have to worry about those sort of things.
Yeah. OK, well, thank you both very much. This is obviously an issue that we will debate more and more, I hope, and hopefully get a result, get Labour to deliver on its pledges. Thank you, all of you, for watching, and please join me again next week for another edition of Talking with Tatchell.